Hello, and thank you for having us to do this sort of online talk. I'm going to be presenting with my colleague Chrystal Safadi in what I think will be a seamless video communication where I'm recording one bit and then Crystal's recording another bit, and hopefully these will edit together. And I'd also like to thank Stephanie Blanksheen and Duncan Garrow, who I've been working with and talking about these things a lot. And this work in various parts has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Leverhulme Trust. So what we want to talk a bit about today, and I hope it's going to work in this format, is how our relationship with the sea has changed, why this matters, and in particular from an archaeological perspective, but you could take this far further. This is really about how we view and understand things within a social context, and that's as relevant today as it is when we're talking about 6,000 years ago. And also the sea's changing relationship with us, because this is a dynamic relationship. The sea is not a static thing. It changes and it has an impact on our society as well. And how we can work with this to create improved understandings of sort of human environmental relations and the reasons why our societies behave and work in the ways that they do. So if we're going to put this in a context of what humanity's been doing with the sea, our sort of earliest evidence for us going out and on the water deliberately comes with the colonisation of Australia around 60,000 years ago. This is the first time that we see that humans have undertaken a deliberate sea crossing. Now, it's entirely probable that there was forays into the oceans and seas much earlier than this, and that we have lots of evidence of coastal populations going back hundreds of thousands to millions of years ago. However, this is the first time that we can see a deliberate and sustained crossing of an open body of water. So our interaction with the sea is nothing new, and it may well be fundamental to the natures of societies that we've constructed. If you look at Australia today, its major urban centres are all the way around that coastline. The sea is critical to who and how we are. But our relationship with the sea has changed dramatically, and with that sort of our embedded understanding of it. And that might sound a little trivial, but actually as an archaeologist it's critical, and I think we'll go on to argue that just within sort of the context of modern life it's also important that we re-evaluate the role of the sea within our lives. So if we think of a trajectory, it's understandable that our relationship with the sea has changed. In terms of just transportation, if we go through time, you might be thinking about early prehistoric logboats. This is a beautiful logboat from the Bronze Age site of Must Farm up in East Anglia, to the Dover boat, again from the Bronze Age, or maybe into the Roman period where we're seeing more substantial trading vessels, lots of evidence, the Anglo-Saxon site of Sutton Hoo, or our neighbouring well-preserved, I should have put in the Grasture in the Hamble River, but this is the Mary Rose, through to sort of the large trading clippers and or even into the modern extreme vessels. But the number of people, the percentage of the population engaging with them travelling by water shifts through time. We've become heavily urbanised, and with that our modes of transportation and interaction have also shifted. If we just look at the mobility by sea today, so this is just a density map of marine traffic from 2011, provided by Marine Traffic. And here you can see that there's huge amounts of activity at sea. We still move most of our freight around the world, but these are on large vessels with smaller crews, and most of us had little interaction with that. The way that most of us see and move around the planet until very recently was by plane. So our mode of transportation comes and goes along these routes. And it's a very different way of travelling. The speed is different, the environment you're travelling through is different, and your experience of it is different as well. In terms of just where we're living, our access to the sea and our sort of daily contact with it within this urban setting has also changed relatively quickly. If we go back to 1870, here's Southampton with the area of exposed intertidal mudflats and water along the River Test. And as we flick through time to the 1890s and 1910s, we can see this getting increasingly developed with the docks emerging, and then the reclamation of the land and the establishment of the larger docks, which we can see today, and to 1960 and then into present day, where that's changed substantially. At a basic level, this also shifted people's day-to-day interactions. If you take this photograph of Southampton, looking down to over here would be Oxford Street, this is the large hotel. People's daily access to, swimming in, and engaging with the river and the waterside that way. It's very different to see how we see it today in terms of the different and distinct economic activities occurring across this waterline. So our mode of transportation, our daily engagements with the sea, and our understanding of it on a sort of a day-to-day basis has shifted. And no talk, I mean, who wouldn't want on their Friday lunchtime talk a quick diversion into French philosophy? But genuinely, it's really worthwhile in terms of thinking about why this is. It's more than just sort of a simplistic thing to say, but actually quite fundamental if you're trying to understand how we rationalise things and how we understand things. So you can take lots of different thinkers who've explored how what we do shapes how we think. But one of the people that's really helped me is Henri Lefebvre, and particularly his work on rhythm analysis, where he's been thinking about the nature of space-time in everyday life. Now, Lefebvre really had a strong, and I think really well argued, argument against the atomisation of knowledge in present society, that we've split things up into distinct domains, and each time we split it up and move it apart, we fail to relink things back coherently. So how things join together, the impact of one thing on another, on shared understanding, easily gets lost. And that's something that we're working very hard to put together again. So part of my work in the university is in the Marine and Maritime Institute, which is deliberately trying to get those atomised pieces back together again. Because this can also fight against sort of abstraction, this sense of concepts which are removed from us and have little impact. And again, that goes to what Lefebvre called the parcelling of experience, that this thing does not relate to that thing, and that actually these things break things down and prevent us from creating rational and well thought out arguments. So essentially, what, how, and when we do things shapes our understanding of the world and how we relate to each other. And there's a nice quote from Lefebvre saying that you've got to listen to the world, and above all to what are disdainfully called noises, which are said without meaning, and to murmurs full of meaning, and finally listen to silences. And this is about signal and noise, about not always paying attention to the loudest point of communication, but just looking at the different qualities of activities in our lives, or at a global scale in the environment that humanity exists with, and thinking about how they interrelate, and not always presuming that the thing that is the most visible in daily life is the thing that's most important. And as an archaeologist, this is really critical because I'm operating in a 21st century world, frequently trying to understand what happened thousands of years ago. So what, how, and when I do things is really removed from the context which I'm trying to study and understand. So we have to find ways to reposition it or re-engage with the different things that those people were doing. What did they do in daily life, and why does that matter? So our experience shape our understanding. And that, if you think in a situation like Southampton, is important. On a day-to-day basis, I might glimpse the water on a few occasions. I'm aware of its importance as a port and how much trade and activity occurs. But in terms of my daily conscious, unless I force myself to think about it, the sea slips out of view. And I think that's probably true for the majority of the population in the United Kingdom. And it's increasingly true for us today. So we've gone from a context where we might be thinking at a global level with lots of international travel or phone calls or seeing these different parts of the world to a situation where many of us are now living within a much smaller and closed down world. And that's really interesting in terms of what that might be doing in terms of our concept of worldview. So how is what we're doing or the limitations placed on us at the moment shaping how we think? And in some ways, it actually might be having the reverse impact. Rather than our world closing down, it's making us more aware of those links which that have been taken away from us. But that's probably because it's quite abrupt, rather than something that's slowly happened through time. As I would argue, our changing relationship with the sea has. It has shifted through time, and at times slipped out of view. But that's only one part of the equation, because the sea is not static. It has also had a very shifting and changing relationship with us. So I'm sure everyone's aware that the world that we live in has changed radically over the last 26,000 years or so, with global sea levels fluctuating by up to 120 metres vertically. And this has had a real and dramatic impact on the configuration of land and sea. So to talk you through this, we can have some more fun, some French philosophy to some equations. And this really is nothing to be worried about. It basically says if we're interested in understanding how sea level has changed, and with that the distribution of land and water, we've got to think about the time, so when in time we're interested in, the sum total of relative sea level change, and also how much sedimentation and erosion might have occurred. And we can actually take care of these things or explore them in a computational sense in that there are two major factors in sea level change. We've got one, which is how much water is locked up on the land as ice, and that is our eustatic factor, effectively, how much water is being sucked up and placed in the ice sheets as we go through periods of climate change. And the other is an isostatic factor, which is how much the Earth's crust has been deformed by the shifting distribution of mass or weight upon it. And so we can calculate those in a computational setting and then test them against records that exist in reality in terms of submerged landscapes, peat deposits, which I'll talk a bit more in a minute. And those allow us to create these sorts of images, which we'll see on the next slide. This is just a really nice submerged forest to say that, this is not abstract. If you go down to the Severn Estuary and walk along the foreshore, you can walk on a forest floor from 7,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, and see tree trunks scattered along it and preserved hazelnuts. These spaces are still with us, they're still present. But if we put it into a computational sense, we can actually work through and see how this changed. So here's the UK around about 10,000 years ago. And you can see that we still have a physical connection in this light green across to continental Europe. And we have this large area which has been come to know as Doggerland or the Dogger Bank. And as we scroll through time, we see the UK change and the nature of the sort of the islands in the North Sea region and along the Channel Zone change in shape and configuration quite markedly. Now this matters. This matters to me in particular because I'm very interested in social and environmental changes that occur with the shift to agriculture, which happens in Britain around 6,000 years ago, 4000 BC. And so it's occurring at a period within which the physical world people live in is also changing. If we zoom in to what's happening around Southampton and across our sort of Channel Zone here, if we look at 11,000 years ago, Southampton's well inland. Okay, we're not a coastal or island location, and if we're on the Isle of Wight, we're located inland. But that rapidly changes as we cycle through time. Until around 7,000 years ago, 5,000 BC, we begin to see the formation of those island settings and the establishment of the waterways. Now again, this changes how people have been doing things, the degree of ease of communication. The sea is not a barrier in terms of splitting people off. This may have eased communication up into Southampton. We know that Southampton's risen to prominence through time because of its place within a really extraordinary maritime setting in terms of its double high tides and accessibility to the water. But if we see how people have explored the nature of connectivity from this landmass to which we call the United Kingdom today, across to different areas through time, you'll see something really quite interesting. And I'm being a little bit unfair here in terms of taking some figures, which are trying to do different things from papers, but trying to explore things. So here's something from a classic work in archaeology from Cyril Fox in 1932, where he is talking about movements of people in and around the United Kingdom. And what's really interesting is Fox's map reflects Fox's experience. The sea routes are marked because this is also how he is moving around in Europe. So the sea is not a blank space, it's textured. It has directionality and it has routeways on it. As we go through time, there's a loss of texture, and there's also a change in academic conventions in how we like to draw pictures, but there's a loss of texture and specificity, which sort of goes hand in hand in how we live our lives as well. And it seemed to become more of a space that's moved across in an abstract fashion rather than a knowable fashion. This is a space that people can communicate across rather than having its own characteristics or its own texture shaping what happens. And this is really important again because there's a very famous, in fact, the world's first, or UK's first television personality of the year was an archaeologist called Mortimer Wheeler who said, you've got to be very careful when we're trying to explore the past that we don't get sucked just into minutiae or explaining things which are really dry and disconnected from the realities of people's lives, both today and in the past, because it just becomes the driest dust that blows. Now, the reason why this is significant is that we know that these changes aren't just computational artifacts or hypotheses. We can actually go and visit them. So this is some geophysical data from the North Sea, which I collected with a colleague, Justin Dix. And these actually what you can see here is a trace through this paleochannel system. So this is looking through it, through a slice through it. And if we take a core through that, we can actually find preserved the buried land surfaces that witnessed this transgression and change, the shift from a freshwater system to a marine space. So these aren't abstract thoughts. People lived during these times, they lived through these changes, and we still have physical evidence, not only for how they lived their lives in terms of pottery, but also for the nature and rate of those environmental changes, and also the changes that occurred in the ocean systems, which may have impacted on how they lived, talked, and communicated with each other. So why is this important in terms of what I'm studying, and how can it go further, and why do we need to think a bit more about it? So this is probably the biggest story of humanity in a way. And this is the transition from us being hunter-gatherers, and obviously I'm slightly biased in how I'm telling you this, to an agricultural way of life. And this story begins around 12,000 years ago in the fertile crescent of the Levant down here, when people begin to collect grasses and re-sow the seeds, leading to a modification or selection in cereal crops. They also start tending to animals such as sheep and cattle, and we see domestication there. They become smaller and more manageable. And these ideas and the people who have been practicing them begin to move. So we can see from the genetic evidence there is a degree of population movement, but also that the practices, the ideas and the technologies move as well. And it shifts across Europe, or comes in, and we see amazing urban settlements in Turkey around 9,000 years ago at sites such as Çatalhöyük. And it sweeps across and up into Europe. There's both a coastal pathway that it follows with really beautiful pottery made with shell impressions, cardialware along Italy, until we get up through Europe and into the Paris Basin and the Atlantic coast of France by around 5,000 BC, 7,000 years ago. And then something very, very interesting happens. I mean, almost mind-boggling if you think about the rate and pace of our lives today. This has covered all of Europe really rapidly in a few thousand years, effectively. And you come to parts of Scandinavia and Britain, and the story becomes very different. So we know, and we've done excavations down here on the Channel Islands, and there's been a lot of excavation in France, that people are doing Neolithic things. They are tending to new cattle, types of cattle, domesticated cattle. They're growing crops. They're making pottery. This is a new technology. They're making new types of stone tool. The Neolithic means the new Stone Age. This is polished stone. And they're burying their dead in a different way. So large-scale societal changes are present in France and in the Channel Islands at around about 5,000 BC. It then takes 1,000 years, 1,000 years, before we see those sorts of social activities occurring in the British Isles. And we know from the modelling that I've just shown you on the sea level changes, and from the physical records which we find submerged underwater, that the distance between Britain and France, even though it was an island Britain, is only around 21 miles or so. Okay, so nothing particularly great. And in fact, that's no different to the distance between mainland France and the Channel Islands, or some of the Channel Islands at that time. So, and we know that people were moving across the water and getting to the Channel Islands. So the water isn't a barrier. There's something else going on in terms of the nature of connectivity or choice. People in Britain for 1,000 years don't go for this new way of life and the changes that it brings. And that is quite an interesting thing to think about. What is it that shapes the reaction and activity here? And then suddenly they do change. And we know there is a bit of genetic change and variation, so there is some population movement. But we also know that people have been moving back and forward for a long time. We've done some excavation work on the Isles of Scilly, which indicate that we've got people or connectivity with sharing ideas with people from the lowlands of Europe around 5,000 BC. So this isn't an abstract void that's been moved into. This is a dynamic world full of mariners moving backwards and forwards, but a social choice not to change. And then suddenly they do. And once we see Neolithic practices beginning, and they first seem to pop up in Kent around 4050 BC, it rapidly moves across the country. So something changes. But what is the nature of that interaction, and how did the sea play a role in this, and particularly coastal communities? Because, and this is the killer part, Humphrey Case wrote a brilliant article about this in 1963, is that none of this is indigenous to the UK. Cattle, domesticated sheep, cereal crops, they all had to be brought here by boat. Okay. These are not indigenous. The predecessor of the cow, the auroch, is a huge beast, sort of about 6 foot tall at the shoulder. You would not want to milk an auroch, but we see domesticated smaller cattle coming in at the start of the Neolithic in the British Isles. This is a maritime endeavour. So how does this play out in terms of the skills that are involved in taking these across to the British Isles? And here I'm going to hand over to Chrystal about how we might rethink about some of these maritime spaces and the connections that they create.
So, in our conceptualization and representation of space and mobility, more often than not in the modern world that we live in today, we rely heavily, for instance, on the use of maps, on digital tools, to know where we are, to locate our destination, to select the appropriate traveling method and map out the route we're traveling on. And in many ways, this representation and conceptualization of space transpires in an abstract realm in which we plan, we follow guidelines and rules, and in another more practical physical realm that is more significant to our lives. So in the latter, conceptualization of spaces, they merge with elements that we are more likely to relate to. For instance, time. So it matters less, let's say, how far we're going, as long as we can get there within an hour. Because time has more relevance to the way that we live our lives, to how we plan our daily routine. So how much time we're willing to spend on a journey has far more impact than on the actual distance between places we're traveling from and to. So to bring this point closer to home, what we have on the screen here is basically a map. It's derived from traveltimemaps.com website. And what it's showing the, what it does is that it allows the user to select the point of departure, to select the mode of transfer. So to the left we have walking, to the right we have cycling, and you input a time period, a window of time, and then it computes the area that is accessible within that time period. So here the point of the departure is God's House Tower for obvious reasons. And it's 15 minutes. So the red area is showing how much in terms of spatial coverage is accessible within 15 minutes of walking and of cycling. Now, obviously, in terms of accessibility, the walking is going to cover less than what you can cover within cycling in 15 minutes. So here we have in 30 minutes and in 45 minutes. Now, I'm not sure why height is showing up as accessible within 45 minutes of walking, but this does flag an important issue, and that is that maritime mobility is by far more convoluted to account for than traveling on land. So this idea of kind of space and time is obviously not a new idea, and bridging space and time is not a new idea. What we have here is an example by Sir Francis Galton, and it was published in 1881. Now, the different colors, they show the time it takes to travel away from London by various means of transport. And this map was produced based on, so Francis Galton assumed that obviously the seasons are favorable, you have immunity is obtained from political obstructions, and friends have already made preparations for travelers and boats. So the data is based on timetables from principal ocean stream packet companies, and on the average time is taken by post to reach various places, and private information furnished from friends and officials. So the sea isochrons are for the most part drawn through the points reached by various passenger streamers in the corresponding number of days. So the various colors you saw from green is within 10 days, yellow is within 10 to 20 days, and pink is within 20, 30 days, etc. Now, today, if we want to monitor maritime mobility and track this movement across the sea, it is relatively quicker and simpler. And in most cases, this can be done live. So here's an example from marinetraffic.com website showing live vessels navigating just the other Friday. And this is possible because of the current technology of available on board ships and available at distance to capture their signal. But to project that to a prehistoric maritime mobility context is far more complex. Because more often than not, what we have is indirect evidence for potential connectivity that is indicated by material culture between various coastal sites. Now, we might know we might know thanks to environmental modeling what the landscape might have looked like and how the sea level has changed, how coastlines have changed ever since. And we might be certain of maritime mobility given, let's say, occupation on islands, or let's say Channel Islands. But still, the variables and parameters we have to deal with can be dubious. So whereas in historical and modern times, we can rely on written information and on existing structured data, constructed data sets from which we can begin to deconstruct and unpick to reach more detailed level of knowledge. And for prehistoric maritime mobility, we undergo an alternative process, one based on deconstructed, fragmented pieces of information that we have to put together to construct, reconstruct, deconstruct, reconstruct again, and it's a circle, it's a continuous process. Now, of the most variables when it comes to maritime mobility is the vessel of transport. Are we dealing with a dugout canoe? Are we dealing with a sailing vessel? And if it's a sailing vessel, is it a square sail vessel? Is it a lateen sailing vessel? And all of these have implications on the capacity of journeys and the time of movement. Now, this differentiation between vessels is not to kind of compare them from less technologically advanced ones to more technologically advanced ones on this kind of time scale of progression, but is rather for the purpose of generating a frame of reference. And I'll come back later to this idea. Now, besides the vessel of transport, the sea is obviously texturized. So it's mobile, and being at sea is a conflation of natural rhythms, of waves, tides, current, visibility, sunlight, of winds, and of course, most important is the practical and working knowledge of all of these variables coming together. So, as I mentioned previously, that thanks to environmental modeling, sometimes we have access to marine data. Now, here we have what we see here, what is depicted on the slide, is a paleotidal modeling that's showing us the magnitude and direction of the paleotides from 6,000 BP, corresponding more or less to the Neolithic period. So the different colors are showing the different magnitude in meter per second, and the direction of the arrow is showing the direction of the tide. And this data set in its temporal resolution reveals changes to the magnitude and to the direction of the tide for each hour. And so with that, we can start reconstructing one of the many textures of the sea and how that texture is spatially and temporally variable. Oh, I must have put too many of them. Now, using that data, we can do a simple experimentation with particle flow. Now, if we were to leave a particle at that green dot there on the screen, where would it flow according to this paleotidal data of magnitude and direction within a 10-hour period of time? Now, this kind of experimentation and tracking of that particle flow is important because it, in fact, highlights the absence of human action. And this absence, in turn, highlights the significance of it to maritime mobility. So without it, there is limited control on speed, on direction, and on directionality. So this is where, coming to that frame of reference, this is where our construction and representation of maritime mobility and the frame of reference to work with becomes paramount. So this frame of reference incorporates the data that we're working with, the processes, the rhythms, the variable. But what's important really is their simultaneity. So archaeological evidence could be pinned down to plus or minus 100 years or 50 years, whereas environmental processes such as tidal and current flow could have a resolution of 1,000 years, let's say. And in addition to this complexity, we're dealing with humans whose behaviors and choices are random, erratic at times, and even inexplicable. So as archaeologists who are exploring and consolidating this data together at hand, it becomes more important to come to terms with the fact that the frame of reference we're working with, in which we're conflating all of this data, is not absolute. And that's why we need to construct, reconstruct, deconstruct these frames, basically have fun, and generate alternative and parallel scenarios. Now, before I play this video, it reveals one of the kind of first attempts at modeling maritime mobility. Basically, it shows the location of sites along the British coastline that show evidence for Neolithic activity. Now here, directionality at sea is just as an experimentation, is taken as a direct line towards the closest landform from those sites. And this modeling of movement incorporates paddling speed and how that changes according to the magnitude and direction of those that paleotidal data, but for one time slice only. And as you see the line, so there's kind of like the routes across the sea and how much time it would take to reach that closest landform from those sites. Now, what's fascinating about this is that it's showing us that within less than half a day, one could reach mainland Europe. Now, of course, that depends where you are across the British coastline, but this type of modeling, it helps us achieve a revitalization of maritime space as a medium of connectivity. It's not so obscure and not so unknown as we would imagine. Now, another way of representing that same modeling of prehistoric maritime mobility, similar to the first slide that I started off on, is according to the area of accessibility within a specific time period. So starting off at a 0 time base, and as we increase the window of time, the accessible region gains color. So here we can see how it's changing within a 3-hour window, a 6-hour window, 12, 18, and so on. And so within a maximum of 4 days, most of mainland Europe becomes accessible across the sea. Now, what's important with this sort of modeling is that, and representation is what it engenders. And here what is engendering is a navigation texture that is emergent from that specific frame of reference, those data that we've conflated together. And in turn, this kind of becomes a source through which we can conceptualize and understand prehistoric maritime mobility and test our archaeological evidence. And personally, I think that this looks rather cool and a bit funky. And if we delve a bit more into the complexity of the data, we can generate more sophisticated models. Now, this is what we call a cartogram. So it's a distortion of geographical space according to the time of movement across the sea. So cartograms, you can distort Cartesian space according to a variable of interest. So here what we're interested in is time. And so each one of those little grids, so when they're compressed together, it means that the time is compressed, so there's space-time compression, and when they are farther away, it means that there is space-time expansion. And this is based on a point of departure, so where you're heading out from, and the point of departure is this orange dot here that is just off of Hainsbury Head. And it's based on, in terms of directionality, is based on 16 bearings. So traveling on 16 bearings from that point of the departure, and taking into account paddling speed and how that changes according to the paleotidal data of magnitude and direction for every hour. So every hour is updating the magnitude and direction of the tide and updating the bearing. And so consequently, what this results is in kind of like a new geography, a distorted geography. So the gray area represents the landscape or geography that is left unchanged. The blue area represents the extension or addition to the geography as we know it, whereas the black area is kind of what the geography as we know it has lost. So if we add the gray and the black together, we'll end up with the modern coastline as we know it. Now, if we look at the Channel Islands, for instance, where the black area is where that has changed, so it's lost, and where the blue area is what has been gained through this distortion.
So to pick up on from where Chrystal's just left off, we can play with space and time and representation. We can use those models that we've generated of changing sea levels and landmass to feed paleotidal models, which in turn we can put back into a human context to think what it might mean in terms of mobility and interaction, the nature of time and space. Because go back to that earlier point I was making about the representation of space and its loss of texture through time, too frequently we leave it as a blue or a blank space, but it has these different qualities which shape human interaction and also the possibilities, the potentiality of what we could achieve if we wanted to. So we can move away from thinking of marine spaces as blank spaces to highly textured and facilitating or acting against certain forms of interaction. And as archaeologists, this is very important because, and this is not a new idea, but the nature or the ease with which that communication can occur can shape and form cultural ties or cultural differences. And these can fluctuate through time because sea level, paleotidal behaviour and so on is not static. We can expect these textures to change as well, these gradients to shift. And understanding the nature of those gradients might help us explain the archaeological record. In essence, we can't just write an archaeology of the terrestrial space and coastal landscapes of the UK. It's always got to be connected to the sea to some extent to make sense. And this really shouldn't surprise us, nor should the outputs that Chrystal's just shown you be seen to be sort of eye-poppingly weird. Because actually if we look at early mapping, and here we have some of Ptolemy's geography, you can see this conflation of time and space as people struggle to relate, this is based on dead reckoning essentially, how long it was taking to sail in a particular direction to record a landmass. And when you see this, the British Isles look very different. We can see the effect of tidal currents, the challenging nature of the Severn Estuary changing that experience, some ambiguity around the Welsh coast. The Irish Sea is particularly interesting here for reasons I'll come on to in a minute, but look at how peculiar and distorted Scotland has become based on that experience of sailing that space. And what we see is a very different geography here. We have a North Sea that has this enclosure, and that follows again those tidal behaviours, the close proximity across the channel and the enlarging distance across particular zones, which is uncannily similar to those patterns or spaces which we see in Chrystal's modelling there. So in essence, what we're using computers here to do is to allow us to play with space, to re-engage with and reprioritise or re-understand how connectivity could have worked. And that is really important to prevent us just using a straightforward mapping modern cartographic representation as dictating social connectivity. But it also works in reverse, because it also stops us from using those maps in modern practice as determinative, and actually makes us go back to those human factors, those issues of time instead of Euclidean distance, being actually very important, or those qualities of daily life that Lefebvre was talking about in terms of understanding the realities of people's day-to-day life. So we have huge amounts of information today, but it may not always be the most appropriate way of setting it out or thinking about it, and it has to be re-engaged with from a human level to make sense. In that light, our narratives of the past, and in some ways the present as well, have to be retold in the light of the image like this that Chrystal put together, of zones of connectivity. Why would I write about an archaeology of southern Britain at this time if we think it is more closely connected to the shores of France? See, we can see these little bubbles of hyperconnectivity. But if we take this sort of potential hyperconnectivity, why do we see a 1,000-year difference if movement across this space was so easy and so quick in that adoption of the Neolithic? Is it a social choice then to do things differently because this is why we do them, this is who we are? And if that's the case, why does that change so rapidly at 4,000 BC? And there are interesting things that we do as a species. We're not always the most rational. Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, doesn't always work for people because we think in different ways. Lefebvre wrote about the three sort of different worlds that we lived in. He said that we had le percu, le concu, and le vécu. We had something sort of the perceived in our head, the lived, and the conceived, and that we actually live in this strange merging of all three. And that can mean that at times when we're hyper-connected, we choose to display our differences even more. We exaggerate them. So we may be that this is, the delay in the Neolithic is about that sort of identity as well, sense of identity. And just to prove that there's nothing new in the world, this image with its sense of a hyper-connected Irish sea zone is actually remarkably similar to how an early political geographer, Mackinder, wrote in the early 1900s about Britain and Britain's seas. He talked about the Mediterranean, the Irish Sea, as the Mediterranean of the British Isles, this pond-like structure with easy flows back and forth. And yet if we look at the archaeological record, the Isle of Man, an island, and the close coasts of England and Scotland demonstrate significant cultural differences across these short spaces. And this has been argued to be a factor of isolation, but equally could be a product of hyperconnectivity, of demonstrating distance in a high flow area. So this is fun to do, but also really meaningful in terms of how it helps us to reconceptualise and create different narratives of space. It also shapes the questions that we want to ask as archaeologists and where we want to work. It also helps us understand where we'll find pertinent data to address it. So the sea isn't just good to think with, it's actually critical to think with if we want to explain and understand things. And part of that challenge is that re-engagement. As I said, there's nothing new under the sun in that sense, as I was referring to someone writing in the early 1900s, a time when people are spending lots of time moving across the water, talking about the importance of the sea in the history of Britain. And actually this is about, as much for us about re-engaging, of recognising that hole within our knowledge, that gap within our experience, that might lead us to write about the past or the present in a particular way, based on the assumption that my normality is representative of everyone's normality and through time. Now that clearly isn't the case. Now that's an interesting challenge not only in terms of the archaeological record, which is interesting and can be retold through this vein, but also for the present day. It also helps us think about the nature of change, and it stops us in a way thinking so much about the 1,000 years, but also starts thinking about the 1,000 years within the context of 118 minutes. Why and how do you maintain cultural difference over such a short space and time, when in reality there should be this close proximity and affinity across this space, and we see a distinct social difference? If anyone has any answers, feel free to get in touch. So this changes the way we write about and think about it. The longue durée, the 1,000 years, is interesting, but it's also the 180 minutes which makes it interesting. And that's because in archaeology, we could have talked for all day, months even, about this topic and explored it in lots of different ways, is we do have evidence for the nature of connections. So as I said, we dug on the Isles of Scilly and we found very specific, these are microlithic tools made in very specific ways, different regionally, which appear to have an origin or an affinity to the Low Countries of Europe. We also see, and people have discussed at length, very specific pottery forms that are found up in Scotland, which are very early in the Neolithic, with an argument made that indigenous populations are unlikely to have immediately made stylised forms of pottery which are identical to one down here without any forms of engagement. And as I noted, that cows and domesticated cattle are not indigenous in the sense and they're brought in, we find evidence of them moving, or joints of meat moving as well. So we can see this flow, this nature of connectivity. The struggle is placing it in the context of how frequent that was and also what it meant. So how connected? Is this axis of communication down here, or is this existing as an anomaly? And the modelling allows us to play with that and to have some fun. And there is no getting away from the fact that what we do in archaeology is fun, and I would make no apology for this. There is a huge joy in thinking through the changing nature of relationships as to why we've become how we are and how things have played out. But the devil is also in the detail. In what this work makes us think about is that the nature and the detail of connectivity matters, because it's shaped how history has played out and it's shaped the nature of communication. And with this, frames of reference and experience become critical. If we constrain our thinking to a particular mode or a particular type of engagement, maybe how we are today, what my daily life is, it's very hard for us to conceive of or understand a broader problem or a different way of being. Therefore, we've got to challenge that sort of established normality as a basis for thought or rational conclusion and seek to push people. And again, that goes back to what Lefebvre was talking about, atomisation of knowledge. How do I speak to someone who hasn't studied this subject or hasn't engaged with this topic or understand the context in which it occurs, because we're going to talk in different ways? So we have to reach those wider audiences and try to help people understand different experiences and different knowledge bases to create more coherent accounts. And this doesn't just impact on how we write about the past, this impacts on what we do in the present as well. So you can take these arguments, and it's not glib that we've been talking about the Neolithic, but if we think of each of our daily understandings of life in Southampton, they are very different. There are lots of people who work in the docks in terms of container transport and materials movement, or on the cruise liners, or in terms of the VTS pilotage and moving of boats. But there are also lots of us who live in very different locations. So how do we coalesce these different experiences of space and allow it to coalesce to the point where we can make informed decisions on what we want to happen in our region? How can we account for what it's like to live on this side of the river to that side of the river? How can we improve degrees of connectivity so these people become connected, share more, and therefore value things in more similar ways? So these are not small sort of facile points to think about. They're actually fundamental about how we organise ourselves and how we relate to each other and how we form human societies. And that's the joy of doing archaeology, is that we can look at the nature of connectivity or the development or the origins of agriculture in the United Kingdom. But what it's really also telling us is about ourselves, about how well we understand the nature of society that we live in, how well we understand each other, and how we are either divergent or coming together to create a more coherent or well thought through approach to what do we want to do as a society. So that might be pushing it a bit in terms of the impacts of this, but it sort of is there as an underlying theme. And also the important point of it is it can be quite fun to do these things, is that it isn't a labour to try and conceive of somebody else's discipline or to conceive of somebody else's point of view. It's actually stretching and actually allows us to think about whole other ways of being which might be more interesting, more fun, or better. So hopefully that's a nice upbeat way of ending a talk, which is part of a series of people doing really different things. And I think that's that joy, saying they're different things, but they're about that shared human experience and the world that we live in. So thank you very much. And I hope that this slightly random mode of separate recordings has worked out, and that there is a thread you can follow, and that you all haven't drifted off over your lunch. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Hi, my name is Mia. I'm the Acting Programme Lead at A Space Arts. I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and if you can spare a few pennies for GHT, please follow the link in the description below to donate to our PayPal account. The money you donate will help support the organisation through this difficult time and allow us to continue developing content like this to keep us all entertained at home. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking here and hitting subscribe, and you can watch more quality content from GHT by clicking here. Thanks again everybody, and stay safe.